The stones of Jericho didn't just tell stories of war. They carried the weight of centuries of mystery, wonder, and fear. Built in a remote time when engineering was still in its infancy, Jericho already boasted a fortification that challenged the very limits of human knowledge. A city that not only resisted, but imposed. The walls that surrounded it were not just defensive walls. They were declarations of supremacy, symbols of a civilization that understood the art of construction with impressive precision. The type of structure that, even in ruins, still commands respect. The strength of Jericho's walls has been described by historians and archaeologists as beyond the ordinary. They were built in layers, with different materials, strategically positioned, on slopes and valleys, and reinforced to resist both time and armies. Even today, scholars pore over the rubble of the oldest known city to understand how these walls, built with limited resources and apparently rudimentary techniques, managed to achieve such resistance. But how did a structure so advanced for its time, considered practically insurmountable by experts, collapse so abruptly and without definitive explanations? If you like historical mysteries that defy logic and reveal the limits of human knowledge, subscribe to the channel. Here every detail counts, and each story reveals more than meets the eye. Jericho was not just any city. Located in the current territory of the West Bank, its existence dates back more than 10,000 years. It was a strategic point, not only military but also agricultural and commercial. The city prospered among deserts and oases, and its defenses accompanied this prosperity. Excavations reveal that its walls underwent several phases of reconstruction and improvement. Some stood double thick, as if the city anticipated powerful attacks before they even became a real threat. Other versions included towers exceeding 6 meters in height, linked to defensive systems at different levels of the terrain. This data is impressive not only for its construction capacity, but for the urban and military planning logic embedded in each layer. There is a consensus among archaeologists that no city at that time had such sophisticated defenses. The walls of Jericho seem to have been designed to last forever. However, they lasted less than expected. The fall of the walls is not just a biblical story wrapped in symbolism. It is also an enigma for modern science. For decades, excavations have attempted to fit fragments of real history with sacred myth. Some evidence points to collapses caused by natural factors. Others contradict accepted dates and chronologies, leaving even more room for doubt. What remains undisputed is that Jericho fell, and it fell in a way that not even the engineers themselves, even with the help of current technology, can explain precisely. With more than 200 centuries between the event and the eyes of those trying to understand it today, the question that hangs in the air remains without a definitive answer. Did they collapse due to human error, natural force, or something that defies known laws? Investigations into the walls of Jericho did not cease with the discovery of its fall. Rather, it was the absence of convincing explanations that compelled archaeologists, engineers, and historians to dig deeper, literally and symbolically. What they found beneath the ancient earth was not just stone and clay, but evidence of surprisingly sophisticated engineering for such a remote time. The first modern excavations, led by Charles Warren and later deepened by Kathleen Kenyon, revealed something that challenged classical notions about construction in ancient societies. The walls were not a simple row of stacked stones. They formed a composite system, with concentric walls and a stone structure with a solid base, topped with mud bricks and protected by steep ramps that made direct access to the top difficult. Furthermore, the land on which Jericho was built played in favor of its defense. The city occupied an elevation surrounded by valleys and natural depressions, which forced any invading army to climb under constant exposure. The outer wall, built on a base of cyclopean stones, was approximately 5 feet thick in some places and high enough to prevent any climbing without equipment. Immediately above it, there was a second internal wall that reinforced protection and increased visual control of the surroundings. Between one and the other, there was a steep and polished slope called glacis, which made any attempt at a frontal attack even more difficult. For many experts, this set of characteristics demonstrates that the builders of Jericho mastered, impressively in advance, principles of defensive architecture that would only become clear again millennia later. The precision with which the stone blocks were positioned and the way they distributed the weight of the structure to resist time and soil pressure indicate advanced technical knowledge. There are records that suggest that the construction of the city's first great walls may have taken place around the year 800 BC or even earlier, which makes the feat even more intriguing. At that time, it was not common to find civil works with this degree of complexity, especially in a city relatively isolated from the great urban powers of Mesopotamia. However, even in the face of all this constructive logic, the collapse happened, and even stranger, no signs of conventional military destruction were found, such as cracks from battering rams, signs of widespread fire, or signs of progressive dismantling. Archaeological layers suggest that the walls collapsed abruptly, with entire sections collapsing at the same time. This makes traditional explanations about siege, sabotage, or natural wear lose strength. There remains then the hypothesis that something deeper and less understood may have caused the collapse of those stones that seemed destined to remain eternal. The silence left by the fallen walls opened space for a terrain where faith, science, and speculation began to compete for protagonism. With no clear signs of destruction by human tools and no conclusive evidence of progressive structural degradation, many turned their eyes to explanations that went beyond the bounds of engineering. Among the oldest and most influential narratives is the biblical account in the book of Joshua, which describes the fall of Jericho as a direct consequence of a divine act. According to the sacred text, the Israelites, after surrounding the city for 7 days and blowing their trumpets, saw the walls collapse before their eyes, not by force or weapons, but by obedience and faith. This version, transmitted through generations, profoundly marked the history of the West, influencing the way Jericho was interpreted not only by theologians, but also by lay scholars. However, as excavations progressed and modern geological analysis technologies were applied, to the archaeological site, alternative hypotheses emerged. One of the most discussed is that of an earthquake. Jericho is located in a region of intense seismic activity, close to the Jordan Valley, one of the oldest geological faults in the region. Some scholars propose that a large magnitude tremor could theoretically cause the walls to collapse simultaneously, especially if combined with instability in the ground or structural failures accumulated over the centuries. There are historical and geological records that prove seismic events in the region at different periods, which strengthens this possibility. However, even this hypothesis does not resolve all the gaps. An earthquake capable of collapsing the Uijie walls would probably have left more extensive marks on other structures in the city, marks that were not clearly found in the excavated layers. Furthermore, the pattern of collapse does not appear random. Entire sections of the walls appear to have collapsed outside the city, which for some archaeologists does not correspond to the typical behavior of an earthquake. This opened the way to more complex explanations, such as the combination of seismic shocks with hidden weaknesses in the original design, or even the impact of poorly recorded extreme weather events, such as torrential rains or landslides. Alongside these natural hypotheses, there are also interpretations that point to less tangible phenomena. Some researchers suggest that accounts about Jericho may have suffered narrative interference over the centuries, merging different historical events into one. Others go further, raising the possibility that the biblical chroniclers themselves interpreted an exceptional natural event as a divine sign, shaping history based on their worldview and theological goals. Regardless of the origin, the fact is that the fall of the walls remains one of the few cases where engineering is unable to offer clear answers. And the more you study it, the more the enigma deepens, as if the ancient city continued to keep its secret beneath the earth that covers it. The questions that echo about Jericho, even after so many centuries, reveal that interest in its walls goes beyond the limits of archaeology or engineering. There is something about the fall of this city that touches deeper aspects of the human experience. The relationship between power and fragility, between what stands solidly and what collapses without warning. The fascination with Jericho persists because it is not just an archaeological site. It is a symbol, a living metaphor that even the firmest structures can collapse in the face of the unexpected, be it natural, divine, or unknown. Over the decades, several studies have attempted to reinterpret the traces left beneath the accumulated layers of Earth. And even with the advancement of dating techniques, digital modeling, and structural analysis, no theory has been consolidated with absolute certainty. The chronology of the fall itself remains a matter of dispute. Some excavations point to a collapse that occurred around the year 1400 BC. Others suggest that the layers attributed to the destruction may be before or even after this period. There is also a gray area between findings and interpretations, where political, religious, and ideological factors interfere with the way data is read and presented. In this scenario, Jericho becomes a stage for debates that go beyond science. Theologians see it as proof of divine action. Archaeologists consider it an incomplete puzzle. Historians try to place it within a timeline where many sources overlap, contradict, or simply do not exist. What can be said with certainty is that the city existed, that it was fortified with an impressive complexity for its time, and that, at a certain point, its walls collapsed abruptly. The reason for this still eludes the most precise tools of modern science. Interestingly, this enigma does not weaken the city's value. On the contrary, it strengthens it. Each uncertainty expands the space for reflection, encouraging new excavations, methodological revisions, and above all, a more critical stance towards the limits of knowledge. Jericho forces the researcher to recognize that not everything can be explained with objective data alone. There are events in history that remain beyond understanding, not for lack of effort, but because they involve variables that are still invisible or narratives that have been lost in time. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the walls of Jericho is not in their grandeur, but in the silence they left when they fell. A silence that even today invites investigation, doubt, and the recognition of what we have not yet been able to decipher. Given this, the fall of the walls remains one of the rare episodes in which the past imposes itself on the present, with more questions than answers. And perhaps Jericho's true strength lies there, not in her physical resistance, but in her ability to continue challenging those who try to understand her. Because there are mysteries that resist time not because of a lack of evidence, but because they are anchored in something that goes beyond what our current methods can capture. And while this lasts, Jericho will continue to be a symbol, not of destruction, but of what humanity still seeks to understand. If you like content that goes beyond the surface and provokes real questions, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. This helps us to continue bringing topics that instigate and challenge. And if you are curious to follow this line of reflection, the next video can expand this perspective even further.